Okay, so last month, Hollis had asked me to do a presentation, and that day I had just finished a huge house in McLean, Virginia, that had some issues, and I thought this would be a good topic to talk about. And it's basically efflorescence at paving areas or any kind of masonry, but mostly paving areas that are over top of finished spaces. And usually they have a concrete slab underneath and then some type of waterproofing system, a drainage board, and then they put the flagstone on top of that. So we'll go over what is efflorescence, what causes it, identifying efflorescence, and how to prevent it. So efflorescence means it is dissolving solids, salts deposited on surface of porous materials such as concrete or brick. It's visible after the evaporation of water. Moisture that creates efflorescence comes from groundwater or rainwater. Efflorescence alone does not pose a major problem in most cases, but can be an indication of moisture intrusion, which may compromise the structural material. And what I'm saying is it may not pose a major problem, but in this case, it did create a major problem. So this house is 2 years old, and this is the drainage system that's used to drain the patio. So the patio and flagstone are up here, and look at all the efflorescence that's coming out of this patio and stone. So you can note that there's rusting at the steel lintels already. There's almost stalactites at this drainage system. So what's happening here is the under drain of this system, which is probably like a dimple board or something that's over top of a waterproof membrane, is allowing rainwater to enter through the flagstone and grout joints. But what's happening, the vapor is creating efflorescence, and it's not allowing it to drain. So it's squeezing this paste out that you can see in this photograph. And you can see it's happening right here, but all along that drainage system, it's all corroded. This is only 2 years old. So here it's same thing. We have water intrusion coming in, and this whole thing, it's not a great photo, but this is all white with efflorescence. You can see that the steel lintel is starting to rust. Again, this is only 2 years old. 3 conditions must exist for efflorescence to occur. Water-soluble salts must be present. Moisture must be available to transform salts into a soluble solution. Salts must be able to move through the material to the surface. Moisture will then evaporate and cause the salts to crystallize, resulting in efflorescence. We have porous building materials: concrete, wood, brick, stone, and mortar are porous materials. Porous materials will wick water by a process called capillary action. As the water moves through the porous materials, salts can be drawn with it. An example of capillary action would be concrete footings that are typically poured directly onto soil without any capillary break, which sometimes is called rising damp. This can be the beginning of how water can wick upwards into a structure. They say that water can actually wick through 6 miles of porous materials. So this is an example of how water is wicking through, and then we have the efflorescence and spalling coming out. This is kind of a good slide right here, because there's destructive pressures, and I'm going to explain this to you in one of the photos of this coming up. But the capillary flow of water reaches surface of building materials, evaporation occurs. As water evaporates, salt is left behind. As this continues, salt concentration increases, resulting in an imbalance. Nature tries to restore the equilibrium through a process called osmosis, and water rushes toward the salt deposit to dilute the concentration. The water rush creates hydrostatic pressures within the porous materials, which may result in destruction. This osmotic pressure can create strong hydrostatic pressure that may exceed the strength of the building materials, including concrete. You can see here the different examples of hydrostatic pressure. When we go down to osmotic pressure, you can see it's 3,000 to 5,000 psi. The structural strength of concrete can be 2,000 to 3,000, possibly 4,000, and the osmosis can create a pressure that's greater than the concrete. So in this case, this house was only 2 years old. You can see this is stone above a garage door. We have the terrace above it. Behind this metal flashing, we don't know if the waterproofing membrane came over that flashing. So what's happened in this case is there's so much efflorescence, it's pushing the stone face away from the structure of the building and ready to tilt off of the garage door area. So you can see there were holes right here and here to try and drain this system, but the mortar joints and penetrations from the railings and not good waterproofing practices right here was creating all this backup of efflorescence behind the stone. That's just an example of what it looks like. That's 2 years, and you can see it looks like stalactites of efflorescence. So what we're concerned about was this face pushing outwards. And I inspected a house in off of Vauxhall Road that this actual face from this condition fell. So you can see within 2 years, look at the deterioration of the steel lintels. This is the staircase, and you can see there's no capillary breaks here, but all this structure was held up by this angle iron, and it's really starting to deteriorate. And you can see how much efflorescence is coming down the wall right here. Here's kind of a good example of what's happening, and we call this back feeding the under drain. So it's basically clogging the drain up that's allowing the water to drain that's coming off of the slab, and it's just done. It's done in a way that it doesn't work, but eventually I'll show you a way that is the remedy for this. So building surface installation problems may lead to the efflorescence. Incorrect use of through wall flashing, use of masonry without sufficient ventilation, the use of masonry in areas that lack proper moisture barriers, joint material failure, and improper ground storage. So here is the underside of a tread that should have a capillary break on it. This is the chimney at this particular house that who knows what's going on with this flashing. It looks like they put like a 2-inch extended flashing out, but it doesn't look like it's like turned down or properly flashed right there. So you can see the result of all the efflorescence on this 2-year-old roof. So this was the patio, and underneath this patio is the finished garage. This house was 20,000 square feet, and it was nicely done. It's just that these mortar joints, all these little voids in 2 years, will create water intrusion. All these penetrations right here. Mortar joints that they appear to be sealed, but they're not. You can see they're starting to have efflorescence, and that's because it's back feeding this patio. Identifying efflorescence. If pinched between the fingers, efflorescence will turn into a powder while mold will not. Efflorescence forms in organic building materials, while mold forms on organic substances. Efflorescence will dissolve in water, while mold will not. Efflorescence is almost always white, yellow, or brown, while mold can be any color. Inspectors should note the presence of efflorescence in their report because it generally occurs when there is excessive moisture, a condition that also encourages the growth of mold. So here's more photos of that chimney. Again, 2 years old, probably not the correct way to do this chimney cap. And this is just letting moisture come through there and allowing this efflorescence to start. Again, we have the rusted lintels. You can see how much efflorescence is just dripping down. Again, this is 2 years old, and sometimes this happens with newer construction. How to prevent efflorescence. You can install capillary breaks, such as polyethylene sheeting between the building and soil. Quality masonry construction, implementing overhanging copings, eaves, and flashings. This also, there's a lot to be said about how the mortar is mixed. You can go on a job site and they may have a mason laborer that doesn't really count each amount of sand and cement and water, and they mix it up. And I've been on a million job sites where the stonemasons are mixing it up on a sheet of plywood, and they're basically not really thoroughly mixing the mortar, and this all contributes to efflorescence. There's increased emphasis on landscaping and sprinklers, using dense tooled mortar joints. When you inspect an older house, we don't see a whole lot of efflorescence on those old 40s or 50s houses. It seems like they used better materials, maybe, but they took care in tooling the joints to make sure that there was no water allowing to be penetrated. Using grout admixtures. Admixtures could be something that we would call like hydrophobic concrete. And basically, hydrophobic concrete would be used maybe in commercial parking garages, parking decks, underground parking decks, foundation walls, because this admixture does not allow a lot of moisture to flow in through the concrete walls. There's also a hydrophobic concrete sealer or a sealer that can be put on the building after it's finished, but it's very time consuming, and if it's not done properly, it will not work. Storing masonry materials properly. You'll see that on job sites, and I'm sure everybody sees it, they just go through, they just stack the bricks on the ground. They're soaking up moisture, and the bags and mortars, they're not covered up correctly. They may be on a pallet, they may not be. That all contributes to all this efflorescence. Here's a detail that you probably won't see around here. When I build houses, I put the capillary break or damp proofing underneath the footing. This is a delta footing barrier, and when they pour the concrete, they lay this fabric on the wet footing and then make the keyway. And then if there is any horizontal rebars, you would put an X right here and put the dowel in there with a hook bar. And we would put in this groove, before we poured the concrete wall, a bentonite rope. But that's a good description of a capillary break right there. And this is what it looks like when we first put it in. And we poured the footings, and then when we're smoothing them out, we put the keyway in and put the damp proofing there. So realistically, the way that house was built, they had a sloped terrace, very slightly sloped, and it drained to the exterior, and that's where we had all the efflorescence on that exterior wall. So the real way to do this is called an IRMA system, and it's an inverted roof membrane assembly. And what that consists of is a slab, and normally these slabs are tilted to a drain. And then we would put a waterproof membrane and then a J drain, which is like a dimple board, put insulation, then a pedestal system that has open joints. So this water would drain down, and then it would go into a drain, and I'll show that in a second. That's not a very good photograph, but basically it's a concrete slab, and then we would use the waterproofing membrane, then have a drainage board, insulation, and a pedestal system. So it kind of looks a little bit like this. And basically, residential home builders should do this. I do it. I won't do a flagstone deck over a finished area without using the IRMA system, because this allows water to penetrate through here, go down into a drain. We don't have mortar joints here. They're very tight joints, but they're on these pedestals. If we ever had to get to these drains, we can pop up any of these stones and get to that drain. But it eliminates so much efflorescence and problems. So these are a couple drawings that my structural engineer uses when we have these issues. And this was repairing a job, and we ended up installing 2 new drains here and tilting the slab and redoing waterproofing everything. So we had punched these drains into the system, and you can see we're tilting everything this way instead of just coming out and going out and dealing with this issue here. And this is where I was saying that this is back feeding and pushing this part of the wall out on this particular house. So this is more of the waterproofing system in details that we use. So whenever we do a penetration, we put a sleeve in, we put high strength grout in, and then fill it with a pourable sealant that's not going to allow water to penetrate these areas. This is more the pedestal system, where we have the roof membrane that's coming and sealing everything, going into this drain. And this drain actually works two ways, drains up here and allows water to come down through here if there's any that's present. So it's a bi-level roof drain. Here's another example of what we did. This is a steel decking, but remember, this was the area that we're concerned that anytime before, this was all just draining here, getting behind here, and pushing this out. Another example of the J drain grout flagstone and allowing this to drain this way. These are some more examples of what we do at different situations at these flagstone terraces. And that's about it. Is there any questions?
So, were you called in to inspect these properties for the specific problem? Or was this a home inspection?
The photos that you saw that were in this was a home inspection. I did 4 home inspections for these people, and they were going to buy this house. The house was beautiful inside. I mean, immaculate. And they saw this, and there was some retaining wall issues also. This house was kind of built on a cliff, and so this was the reason they didn't buy the house, because this to fix this at their house, at this particular house, would be about $150,000.
Okay.
Now the builder said, I'll come and wash this off. But that's not the solution, because the reason the efflorescence is getting in there is water's coming in, and then when it gets hot and dry, it's drying out and vaporizing. Well, when people wash the efflorescence, they're using water. So they're putting more water into the problem. Does that make sense to you? Like,
right, because you're talking about greater to less. But every
right.
time it rains, you're going to get that water pressure, I guess, as you described.
Right. So you get like this wall was basically tilting a little out, pushing out, because there's so much efflorescence between the stone and the concrete structure behind it. You wouldn't believe it, but it happens. And this is something that you guys should really pay attention to when you see this kind of stuff. Pay attention to how this terrace is draining like this, because if it's draining like this, you're just going to have problems.
One of our members asked, are you aware of any type of repairs that were ever done with it, or you were out of there after the inspection? That was the end of it.
This particular house we were done with. But I was involved in one on Foxhall Road that we had to tear everything out and redo it. Put the one on Foxhall Road basically leaked through the steel beams in the garage, and then those steel beams continued into the interior of the home, and water just seeks its own level and had nothing but trouble. And it was probably, I mean, just the terrace was $150,000.
So they'd have to rip it down to basically the structure and leave the slab and start from there over again.
Right, and then you're gonna punch interior drains in, and then put a waterproofing membrane, and that you'll regrade everything. And then the best way to do it is to put those flagstones on pedestals.
Right. And then you have elevation problems.
You don't have elevation problems because the pedestals are adjustable, and you can get all sorts of pedestal systems.
But if that door was not very high up from the finished level of that patio, you may not have room to build everything up.
Let's see if we have a picture of it.
Yeah. Nick, we have a question. Is that AMV question mark, or was there a drainage plane underneath all that?
There's a J drain, the dimple board underneath that,
Okay.
and then there is a waterproof membrane underneath the J drain, but it's so filled with efflorescence, and we're having this osmosis occur, and it's basically going to push the flagstone right up, and it's going to push the stone off the face of the wall. And the only reason I'm bringing all this up is because I had experience with the house in Northwest DC on Foxhall Road.
Uh-huh.
I mean, it was a complete disaster. And this is all, a lot of architects design it this way, and the builders build it this way, but they don't really realize what the problems are going to happen afterwards. I met the builder here. This particular client was very particular, and we had structural engineer out, and we met on another day, and we met the builder, and he said, listen, I did everything that the plans called for, but the plans, they really weren't right. So and this builder's pretty known, and it's just these type of patios that are on top of finishes below. They have to be done correctly, and if you're not inspecting that and telling the people that, you're going to have problems a couple years down the road.
And your opinion is a floating floor and the inverted system with the drain versus having the water dump out over the edge is the only way to go?
Oh yeah, yep. Because even if you put a gutter right across there, it's not, the efflorescence you're seeing is here, but it's pushing so hard back that it's pushing the membrane behind the stone veneer. So it's getting behind the 6-inch stone veneer back in here, and it's coming out all along here. So it's just a hard way of doing it. Let me see if I can get that door, if there's a picture of that door. So basically, if you were building a house, and Like that's 4 inches drop. So we could easily take care of that with a pedestal system. So that there should be drains in interior drains in here, and this system should be draining this way and letting it just do its thing.
Uh-huh. All right. Let me scroll up. We had another question here. What is the role of the ice? What is the role of the ice damage in a scenario like this? Would ice destroy the connection between the components when water gets trapped in there?
Well, yeah, I don't know that I I don't know that ice would get in there because we have the conditioned space underneath. But um, you know, the uh, the bigger issue is the osmosis pressure, that osmotic pressure, um, not letting, because it's trying to find its equilibrium. We have these salts coming from the efflorescence, and water is being sucked in to kind of neutralize that. In nature, that would happen, and then that pressure, that water pressure, just going to push these flagstones off of that patio.